All That's Left is made possible by our supporters on Patreon. If you don't already, head over to our page so we can continue doing this work. This is All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice, and I'm your host, Sam Carliner. I'm joined by fellow Left Voice editor and comrade, Maryam Alaniz. Maryam is an Iranian-American PhD student living in New York and the editor of Left Voice's international section. It's so great to have you here.
Hey Sam, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Of course, I wish it was for a more pleasurable reason. We are going to be talking about the rapidly escalating war in Ukraine. You are going to be having an amazing conversation with our comrade in France, Philippe Alcoy, about the background context of how we got here, the history of tensions and conflict between Ukraine and Russia, the role of NATO and the US in pushing their own form of imperialism, which has greatly escalated things. I'm really excited for people to hear that conversation between you two. But of course, we want to start with what immediately has prompted us to make this our latest episode, our latest conversation. So let's get into the news of this, which, of course, we are going to be summarizing and getting into detail with later. So for a lot of people, this conflict really started playing out in winter as Russia started making troop arrangements along its border with Ukraine. And what a lot of people need to understand is that while these troop arrangements began in the winter, for years now, there has been a conflict over Ukraine's potential admission into NATO. And this is a way that US imperialism and Western European countries have been trying to expand their own imperialist influence within Europe. They essentially have been growing closer and closer with Ukraine. And in fact, the Ukrainian government is very much a proxy or some might say puppet of U.S. interests. And that has caused a lot of alarm bells in Russia, where they see Ukraine as sort of their sphere of influence, where they maintain their economic interests as well as where they have a security foothold within the region, essentially a buffer to keep them not directly at the border of a NATO country should a war between Russia and NATO break out. So for this reason, there's been a lot of escalating conflict over the years in which Putin has been demanding Ukraine cannot enter NATO. It would be a threat to our security. And he is right that it would be a threat to Russia's security. Of course, he has, as we've stated, his own business interests, which are not about the interests of the Russian working class. But NATO is a military alliance that is hostile to Russia. And really, the U.S. has not been giving Russia any reason to believe that it isn't being hostile to them because whenever Putin has said this is a security threat to us, the U.S. has said, oh, well, Ukraine can join any military alliance it sees fit. And it's important that people understand that that is why Putin started essentially making these military arrangements to try to signal that, he could take military action if he sees it as the ultimately only way to ensure that Ukraine will not be brought into NATO. So that whole conflict played out in a lot of posturing and threats back and forth between Biden and Putin. Of course, with European powers within NATO playing their own sort of mediating role, although, of course, mediating because they want to also preserve their own interests, which are really tied between Russia and the US. And that was the case for quite a few months. Now, things really changed. Things really changed this week. Before I get into some of the more rapidly playing out things, Maryam, I don't know if you want to real quick throw in anything I might have missed of how things played out leading up to this week.
No, I mean, it's been a really complicated situation and a really delicate one. And I think, as you were mentioning, like for NATO, for US imperialism, and even in some ways for Russia, war, it was not, the first option on the table. There was many weeks of, attempts at negotiations. And Putin is very much trying to put forward a tactic that we see a lot of Bonapartists use, in which, they use, the pressure on in the form of deploying troops or other sort of tactical measures as a way to build an upper arm in negotiations. But the situation escalated quickly, so clearly that maneuvering has opened up a new situation in which there's more of a military element now. The Russians are actually engaging in a military conflict in Ukraine. And I don't know if that's something that, that NATO particularly expected, or that even I expected in a lot of ways. But it does open up a new phase in this conflict that has a lot of unknown consequences. One thing that's been really interesting to see about the response in terms of how things have been escalating and all of that has been also how we've seen these so-called like progressive lawmakers respond to this crisis as well. Like, a lot of progressivism in the US only extends to domestic policy issues. And I think that's been really interesting to see as things have escalated, that there really is this sentiment among even a sector of the left that the way forward is for the U.S. to intervene in the face of the growing escalation.
I do just want to encourage people. You describe Putin as Bonapartist, and I encourage people to read our articles on leftvoice.org, which get into what it means for a leader to be Bonapartist. And yes, you're right that AOC did call for sanctions. Specifically, she has a tweet. This is not the full tweet. This is a sentence from it, but a tweet which says, "The U.S. is right to impose targeted sanctions on Putin and his oligarchs." And there is no such thing as targeted sanctions. I mean, it's false that we've seen quote targeted sanctions used on different countries that U.S. imperialism does not have full influence over, and when this is done, it still ends up hurting the workers of those countries by depriving them of vital needs like food and medicine. And yeah, we've also seen other members of the squad, Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, signaling their own support for economic warfare, because that's what sanctions are. But I do want to move on to some of the other ways that the international community has been responding, and I'll start with Russia. Russia is very shortly after Putin launched this attack, Russians took to the streets to protest it, calling for no war. And I really want people to understand that Putin does not represent the Russian working class, and we are seeing that. They were quick to mobilize. There were especially big protests in St. Petersburg and Moscow. And if the US launches sanctions, it is these protesters who will be hurt by them and disempowered by them. And these protesters are challenging Putin's assault on Ukraine. we do believe that the way for this war to stop is for the people around the world, to take to the streets and demand that this war not happen, demand Russian troops out, demand no sanctions on Russia. And we have seen some of those protests. Some of our comrades have participated in more left protests in Madrid, Barcelona, and Berlin. One chant that I really, really liked that came out of Madrid was "Your wars, our dead," because that's the thing. The people waging these wars are not the same as the people who will die from them. And your conversation with Philippe, I know, is going to really touch on why that is the case and how people who are really scared and want to do something in this moment can take action in a way that supports the people, not the capitalists who are pitting people against each other for capitalist interests. And with that, I'm going to pass this episode off to Maryam, who's going to talk to our comrade Philippe about the geopolitical context of this situation.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for your introduction. So I want to give a warm welcome to Philippe Alcoy. He's a writer for Révolution Permanente, specializes in global geopolitics, and has written extensively about the current crisis in Ukraine. Welcome, Philippe. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, hello. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem. So, as we've both and all the listeners have noticed, this week has been a pretty sharp escalation in a crisis that's been brewing since the end of December, but definitely has a lot of historical roots that I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about. But how do you characterize what's going on right now, and especially what's been happening this week and what it means? Of course, the situation is still very open, but how would you characterize the sort of escalation that we've been seeing?
Yeah, I think that we can say that this is a totally reactionary war. This is the first thing, because on the one side, the Russian side, it's Russia and Putin is they are following reactionary goals, nationalistic, and about their defensive strategy, and they want to retake control over Ukraine. But on the other side, the Ukrainian government is completely pro NATO, pro imperialist. So in the middle, you have the working class and masses of Ukraine in this battle, this reactionary battle. Of course, what is happening now is a clear aggression from Russia and Putin. But it would be very simplistic to say only that this is an aggression of Russia, and then the NATO and imperialist power are on the democratic side, or I don't know, of peace side. This is not really true if we see what was going on in this region almost since the fall of the Soviet Union. So just to give one first definition of the situation, I think that the Russian move is aggressive, but the strategic goal is defensive. And on the other side, NATO position now seems to be defensive, but the reality is that their stance since the fall of Soviet Union is aggressive against Russia. They are trying, yeah, they are trying to from this since this time they are trying to circle to contain Russia. So what we saw this week, it's maybe one of the worst crises in European continent since the I don't know, maybe the last 30 years. But as you said, the situation is really open for the moment. But what is clear for workers and people from Ukraine and Russia and also in the wider region is that there is no progressive camp in this war.
Totally. And I think it'd be great if we could talk a little bit more about like the strategic objectives of Russia, and we can also get into it about obviously the US and NATO. But in terms of the strategic objectives of Russia, you were talking a little bit about the history, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, um, about how Ukraine, or having influence over Ukraine, which used to be part of the Soviet Union, is strategically really important for Russia for a lot of different reasons. So I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, and also why, NATO is concerned with Ukraine. Why is NATO? Why is it a strategically important country in that sense?
Yeah, NATO was created to protect Europe in the eventuality of war uh, coming from the Soviet Union. But in the moment of the fall of the Soviet Union, the question was, it is useful to keep this imperialist alliance still alive as the Cold War was over. But what's happened at that time was that NATO passed from a group of essentially imperialist countries. It doubled the size of the alliance, and they most or yes, many countries from the former glacis. I don't know if you say that in English, from the former influence zone from the Soviet Union, joined NATO. So the policy of the imperialists, and especially of United States, was to contain Russia and impose a kind of humiliation of Russia again after the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you see the map, it is clear from the Baltic states until Turkey, you have a kind of circle passing from by Poland, Romania, Hungary, until Turkey. And this is clear an offensive policy against Russia. Capitalists, imperialist capitalists, tried after the fall of the Soviet Union to impose to make Russia a kind of semi-colony of capitalists, or Western capitalists. They tried that during the 90s, but at the end of the 90s, with Putin arrived in power, it starts to change. Russian states became more and more strong, or no, stronger than in the 90s. Putin tried to make Russia a big power again. But of course, so the policy of NATO at that time was to contain Russia. But why Ukraine is so important for Russia? Because Russia, in this frame of aggressive and really offensive policy of NATO, Russia tried to defend its state. So, if you see also the map, Belarus and Ukraine are the most important territories to defend the Russian state. Of course, Belarus today is an ally of Russia, But the problem is Ukraine, that since 2014 have a pro-Western government. So for that reason, Putin is trying to retake influence over Ukraine. I can say even that what Russia did in Syria was meant to try to negotiate with Western powers. So it's for that reason that now Putin is trying to retake Ukraine. It was two phases or two steps of the strategy, Russian strategy. At the beginning was to try to negotiate, a kind of military negotiation or military diplomacy. On the other side, Joe Biden and the United States didn't want to concede anything to Russia. So since last week, I think we are in another step or another phase of this strategy of Russia, that is direct attack to try to make Ukraine concede or capitulate.
Totally. And you just briefly mentioned about how, particularly the US and NATO, they're not really interested in going into a military conflict or a direct military confrontation with Russia and Ukraine. And I was wondering if you can expand on why their strategy has mostly been to offer up negotiations, even now, even after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And in Biden's speeches this week, obviously still trying to maintain this sort of tough on Russia tone, but also providing an exit out of this crisis in some ways to Putin. So I was wondering if you could talk about why, in the context of the political situation, that's been the approach of not only the US, but of NATO countries and even of China in some ways.
For now, it's clear that no country from NATO wants to intervene in Ukraine against Russia. Directly intervene in Ukraine, because they are intervening in Ukraine actually. Because Ukraine is not such strategic country for U.S. Global strategy. But Ukraine is really useful to imperialist powers to press Russia, to try to press Putin and force him to negotiate with them. So they will try to use Ukraine also as a as a pawn to press Putin, but they will not risk a global war, a nuclear war against Russia for Ukraine. They are using Ukraine against Putin and Russia, but not. They will not risk a big war like that. But what we saw those last hours and days, I think it is more and more clear that NATO will fight a proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. There are many governments are sending arms to Ukraine. Some weeks ago, United States, I think, sent $200,000 in arms to Ukraine. The UK sent javelin missiles, anti-tank missiles, etc. They are, all of them are, and even Germany today announced that they will allow exportation of German arms to Ukraine. So I think and of course, the policy of sanctions also a part of a kind of offensive or reaction of NATO against Russia. So of course they, at least until now, they will not risk a big war, a global war against Russia, but I think that cynically they can, especially the US, can say, well, a little Afghanistan for Russia in Ukraine is a pretty good for us. So cynically they can say that and try to keep this warrior stance, etc. Another example. Yesterday, Ukrainian President Zelensky said that he was able to negotiate with Russia, and today he has a totally different stance, saying that they will win against the invasion of Russia. So, so yeah, the policy of NATO is not to go to a direct war against Russia, but they are arming, giving weapons, etc., for the enemies of Russia.
Yeah, and I think like one of the things that's really interesting about, you know, the crisis that obviously the US, Russia, and the NATO countries and Ukraine are dealing with right now is like it's in the context of other crises, right? Of the pandemic, of an economic crisis around the world, of domestic and social crises that both Putin and Biden in particular are facing. And so I, you know, just thinking more specifically about the US, how much do you think, you know, the domestic crisis that Biden has in the context of, you know, the growing inflation in the US, as you noted, like a sense of exasperation with wars and military engagements among, you know, the US working class that has gotten nothing out of previous wars, you know, and you know, obviously the pandemic is still a factor. How do you think the accumulation of these contradictions are aggravating this crisis, this geopolitical crisis that we're seeing in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that the national politics in the US are really geopolitical. So, in the context of difficult situation, economic situation, social situation in the United States, it's a bit a good way to create a kind of national and even international union again, behind Joe Biden against the evil Russian and Putin. So of course, I think that this this is a factor, an important factor, but not the only one. You know, in 2018, the United States said that Russia and China were the biggest enemies of the global order. So, of course, maybe we have here a combination of national factors and global strategic factors too. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know specifically the situation in the United States to more specific, but of course of course there is an internal and national factor. As for Putin is the same. For Putin is the same. The social situation and economic situation in Russia is really hard for the working class. It's contradictory too, because this war can make worse the economic situation, not only in Russia and Ukraine, but globally. Russia is not only a gas and petrol supplier, but also Russia is a very important player in the food market, in global food market. So I think that it's clear that we will see some consequences in inflation of food market, food goods. So yeah, that will be. It's in this way that we will probably see some social and political consequences far from Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah. And I think like the reason or the fact that, Biden doesn't have a lot of social support going into a conflict like this is part of the reason why he's having a lot of challenges like dealing with what's going on. And his approval ratings obviously have been going down. There's been tons of polls polling the US populace about whether they would support a war in Ukraine, and most have said no. So I think that's definitely something that's, complicating the situation in a lot of ways. But then at the same time, we have like Trump, who is pretty vocal in his support for Putin, calling him a genius. And he has a base that's important in the United States. I don't know if there's been similar phenomena in France or in other imperialist countries in terms of the response to the situation, but I think that's something that's also really complicated the situation, because traditionally, as we know, like the bipartisan imperialist regime is really strong in putting forward a united front in these moments of geopolitical crisis, and really putting forward strongly the interests and the line of the establishment. And I think the fact that that's not happening now is certainly something that makes things really challenging for Biden. But I also wanted to talk and switch gears a little bit and talk about China, because you mentioned, how obviously both Russia and China are adversaries of the US, but in particular, the US and China are, head to head in this sort of strategic confrontation. And what's going on in Ukraine has implications for that. So I was wondering if you can talk about how you see this crisis in the context of the growing confrontation between the US and China.
Yeah, probably the the current crisis is not a good news, but for China, it's better that Western powers are concentrated in Ukraine more than in China and Taiwan. So I think that it's not to say good news, but for them it's a kind of pause. But the hostile stance of not only the US but also European countries against China is pushing China and Russia to form a kind of bloc, defensive bloc. Of course, they have some contradictory interests in some regions of the world, especially in Central Asia. But at the same time, they must defend themselves against the United States. So I think that is what we are seeing now. China is not supporting directly the attack on over Ukraine, but they say okay, they will not have a stance against Putin and Russia. Also, I think that it's difficult to say that Ukraine is what China will do with Taiwan. I don't know. I don't think But I don't think so. We can never know, but I don't know that things are so mechanic, so easy to transfer from one situation to another. But it is clear that we are now in a very, very risky global order situation where the fight against Islamism is not the priority of the imperialist countries. Now the priority is confrontations between global powers, and even even in the West side, you have a lot of contradictions. The policy of the United States in the Indo-Pacific zone is pushing Russia and China together, but at the same time, the attack of Russia is reunifying the NATO alliance, because some months ago, we saw the confrontation and frictions, between France, the United States, Australia, and UK over the subs question that and even 1 year and a half ago, France and Greece were really close to a war against, or a war, I don't know, but a big confrontation with Turkey, another NATO member. So that is the world where we are now, I think. And China, the question of China is, of course, in the center of this new global situation.
Yeah, I think what you're saying about this sort of shift that we're seeing toward confrontations between powers is really important, and it really harkens back to this idea that Lenin really put forward, that we're living, that the imperialist stage of capitalism is really an era of crises, wars, and revolutions. And I know, at least for my generation, like, obviously seeing the war in the many wars in the Middle East have been really politicizing. But we haven't really lived through, we've lived through many crises, maybe not so many revolutions. Um, but I think we're seeing through these conflicts, we're being reminded of the violence of this system. You know what I mean? And how quickly things can escalate. And even what you're saying about, the contradictions of NATO. Like, I grew up under this idea of globalization, of, during the neoliberal years, that there can be peace and harmony between all of these different countries, and like it's some kumbaya all the time. And it's like one day it is, and then the next day it's not. So I mean, it's just really highlights the instability. I mean, I think it has a lot to do with the, like I was saying earlier, these accumulated contradictions going back to like the 2008 crisis, which was a big rupture in terms of, neoliberalism, and we saw more nationalism among countries, and really important geopolitical crises, small ones, but now we're seeing, them explode into potentially larger confrontations. Like, what's been happening in Ukraine is not new, as we've been discussing. It's something that's for many decades now. The tensions between Russia and NATO have been accumulating, um, but against the backdrop of growing just geopolitical tensions, this confrontation between the U.S. and China have the potential to explode into something bigger. So I think it's just a really important reminder, especially for leftists, for socialists. And at the same time, it's not that World War III is like happening right now. Like, the situation is open, it's complicated, it has a lot of contradictions. Um, but it's definitely a reminder of the brutal nature of the system, and how quickly things can transform into and escalate into greater confrontations. So I don't know if that's something that you've been thinking about a little bit as well.
Yeah, today it's easier to imagine wars and crises, and a little bit more difficult to imagine revolutions. But what I want to say is that for we can say that capitalism is war, means war, but for the bourgeoisie, it's not so easy to go on war to and make war. It's really risky. I don't know. I don't think that the Putin regime now is quite about that. If we take only the situation in Ukraine and Russia, many Russians don't like war against Ukraine. They see Ukrainians as brothers. They don't hate Ukrainians, and many Ukrainians don't hate Russians. And if this kind of adventure, I don't know if you say that in English, of Putin in Ukraine, if it fails, maybe he will see at home a big political and social crisis. It's not for sure, but maybe. At the same time, the national defense of Ukrainians can go from a nationalistic or national field to a more economic and social field, and then transform the resistance against Russia to something more interesting. And as I said, the economical and political consequences beyond Ukraine and Russia in other parts of the world maybe will create some social mobilizations. The last time the food prices were high, really high, not yes, well, at least a very important moment was in 2008, and we saw in Haiti, in several countries of Africa, popular mobilizations against that. So yeah, I agree with you. We are in as Lenin said, we are in a crisis, war, and revolution epoch, and we are and today, as I said, we see several crises, many wars, but also we see resistance, even in the United States, in Europe, in Africa, in Middle East. So this is not easy situation for the bourgeoisie. So I think that for working class, for young people, for masses in the world, it's really important to follow what is happening in Ukraine, but also to understand the nature of this war, and to prepare for this kind of things that the bourgeoisie are preparing for us, and then resist and maybe go forward. A war is awful, but we must see clearly what is happening to try to transform this awful situation in something that can bring some hope for workers and oppressed people against the bourgeoisie and all those people that are fighting war now.
Yeah, I really agree with that perspective that, there's also been a lot of class struggle in the face of this broader capitalist crisis, right? That we've been experiencing. And, in terms of this situation, obviously there's been really inspiring protests in Russia against really, really harsh repression. Sort of like what you were saying, that this war is also unpopular among Russians who are, who have been facing a deep economic crisis, cuts to their pensions, all sorts of things, but also, the sanctions that are being imposed on Russia are already having a really deep impact on the masses there. Like they can't even access money in the banks, because the banks are responding to the sanctions, for folks who even have savings at all in Russia. The ruble is being devaluated super rapidly. I think I saw a statistic that in one day was devaluated by 40%. And food prices are going up because of the sanctions. Like, my family's from Iran, so the idea of how sanctions can really flip your life around from one day to the next, I think is like really crazy. But yeah, I think like there's been a response, and people are not happy. And we've seen left expressions of that, and also some right expressions of that, of course, in the midst of this broader crisis. But I think that it in terms of the more progressive responses of people who are taking to the streets right now around the world to say no to this war, to say no to NATO intervention, no to Russian intervention in Ukraine, I think is really promising in terms of thinking an exit out of this crisis. And I think it's something we should reflect on more, because I think a lot of people are really confused right now. Like, do I send money to Ukraine? Or like, like people who are listening right now, who are concerned and super saddened about what's happening and are pissed off. They're mad that we have to live through another war. I mean, because of course it affects the Ukrainian masses more than anybody else, but as the working class, we know that what happens to workers in one country has consequences for workers in other countries as well. So I think it's, it would be interesting to talk more about, like, the way out of this crisis, and some of the different perspectives that people have. For example, here, a lot of people have this idea that, what Putin is actually doing is progressive, that he's fighting against imperialism, which, I think is a really mistaken idea, because as you were saying earlier on, like, this is a super reactionary invasion. Like, Putin's doing this for, the interests of the Russian bourgeoisie. He's not doing this for the interests of the working class, the masses around the world, but there is that idea out there as well.
Yeah. No, for me, it's clear that this is not progressive and anti-imperialist war. I don't know if you saw the statements of Putin before the attack. He said that Ukraine was a mistake of Lenin, was a creation of Lenin. His statement was clearly anti-communist, saying that it was false, historically false, but saying that Ukraine, it's an invention of communists. And we can say that the one of the better policies of the Bolsheviks was this policy about the self-determination of nations. And it's for that reason that Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union. For this reason. So no, Putin is not an anti-imperialist. Clearly, a reactionary leader that follows the interest of Russian capitalists. That for me is clear. But at the same time, for Ukrainian and the situation in Ukraine, I think that there is not a simple answer for that, because the situation is really complex. It's not a situation that emerged 2 or 3 months ago, but we are talking about 30 years of policies policies of NATO on the one hand, and of Russia on the other hand. So it's not easy. Today, what is the imperialist leader saying is that they are fighting for the democracy and peace, but they create this situation of war also. They participate in this escalation. Not only 30 years ago, but last week and some weeks ago, they were saying to Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, to stay strong against Putin, and not for to accept to negotiate with him. So that is a form to prepare for war, to push Putin for war too. So I think there is a structural problem for Ukraine. A capitalist Ukraine can only exist with an alliance of submission to Russia or to the Western imperialists, the elites, the Ukrainian elites, the Ukrainian capitalists, the Ukrainian bourgeoisie. That is their nature, to capitulate to Russia or and shift sometimes the same shift to the Westerns. So today, talk about an independent capitalist Ukraine is an illusion. It's for that reason that we think and we say that the only solution for a real independent Ukraine is a workers and socialist Ukraine. That I think that today it can be seen as a really difficult objective goal, but I think that is the only way to avoid to fall in the Russian camp or in the Western camp, and try to create an independent work for the working class and a socialist and revolutionary perspective in this situation is the only solution. Of course, it's really difficult because at the same time, Russia is killing people. And the responsibility, there is an aggression of the Russian army, but also the responsibility is of those oligarchs and the Western leaders that create this situation. It's like in Libya. In Libya, they were saying also that Gaddafi were killing people. That was true, but what they did in Libya today is worse, maybe. And what we can't let them do the same in Ukraine. That must be clear for everyone, for workers, for masses, for all those people that supports Ukraine against the aggression of Russia. But we must say clearly, we are not with Russia and we are not with NATO. We are against both, because both are creating a situation in which Ukraine will maybe become a kind of Libya. That could be a very very bad perspective for working class, not only in this region but around the world.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that, you know, the only progressive way out of this crisis, especially considering the your characterization of Ukraine, is for the working class there to lead a way out, independent of the influence of any bourgeois political force, whether that be from that one that has Russian interests in mind or the interests of the Western imperialists in mind. And since we both live in imperialist countries, I think, you know, one thing that's really important and we talk a lot about on our pages is how important it is for socialists, for workers who live in imperialist countries to denounce the actions of their governments, to put their full support toward the Ukrainian masses in the context of this situation, not toward, Zelensky's government, who is very much, as you said, subordinated to the interest of Western imperialism, not toward Putin, who's playing an entirely reactionary role in this situation. And I think we have to be really, really strong in denouncing. I mean, I live in the U.S., so U.S. imperialism is the U.S. is the most powerful imperialist country in the world. Even in some ways, like some of the interests of the European imperialist countries are subordinated to the U.S. So I think like it's really important that we build solidarity, we take to the streets, we denounce our governments in the face of this situation. And I think that's something that is particularly important for those who live in imperialist countries, to not have any illusions in what, like what Biden is saying, what you were saying earlier, how he's trying to paint this as democracy versus authoritarianism kind of situation. And how dare he speak about democracy? Like the U.S. We all know how quote unquote democratic the U.S. is. Democratic for who? For the ruling class, of course. And so I think like that rhetoric, which of course, like unfortunately, a lot of people from our class buy into. It's something that we really need to challenge, and really, really point out as something that is completely wrong. So I don't know if you have any concluding thoughts. I'm gonna leave it open to you.
Yeah. No, just to say something about what you said, because here in France and in several countries of Europe, at least here in France, we have a lot of people demonstrating against this aggression against Ukraine, but also a lot of illusions about the NATO policy. And of course, in imperialist countries, it's really important to discuss about that, to say clearly that NATO, if Russia wants to take control over Ukraine, and Ukraine ally with NATO, is not a free Ukraine. On the totally contrary. And if we allow NATO to appear as a democratic force and peace force, this is the workers and masses around the world that will pay the price of that. We don't forget Afghanistan, don't forget Iraq, don't forget Africa. That is the results of NATO policies. So it's really, really important, I think, to say clearly in this war there is not, unfortunately, there is not a progressive camp. NATO and Russia are reactionary camps. So it's really, really important what you said. And yes, it's for that reason that for us it's really important to continue to follow what is going on in Ukraine. That this situation will have consequences for the world.
Well, I want to thank you so much for everything that you've shared, for your perspective, and encourage everyone that's listening to read all of our coverage, in particular Philippe's really excellent reporting on the current crisis. And you can, as always, head over to leftvoice.org, and also follow us on social media. We're at left_voice. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook. And as always, we can only make this kind of coverage and reporting and analysis possible with your support. So feel free to head over to our Patreon and subscribe, to share our articles with your coworkers, with your friends, with even your family. Start discussions with them. Go to protests if you're in New York. You might bump into some Left Voice comrades at any protests that come up. If you're in France, maybe you'll bump into Philippe. But we hope to see you on the streets. And thank you again, Philippe, for your time today.